Welcome. Today's video is all about why it matters if you might be a highly sensitive person. And also we're going to talk about the role that autism might play in terms of being a highly sensitive person. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and yes, it is early, and so I am whispering because one of my kids is still sleeping. And also, if you know that when you hit a certain age, it takes your face about 6 hours longer to wake up than you do. And though I've been up since 5 and it's 8, that's still happening, so bear with me. All right, so we're going to talk about why it matters. First, we're going to talk about the science of an HSP, but what I want to say clearly is that many people believe that HSP is actually code for autism. Now, there are mixed ideas and research around this. What we do know for sure is that highly sensitive people often have sensory processing sensitivity. They're basically sensitive to all of the ways their brains take in sensory information and how that affects their lives. And that's also true for autistic people. So we're going to talk about the qualities of an HSP, a little bit about what trauma does to HSP individuals, and talk about the role of autism as it relates to trauma and being more highly sensitive. The reason why this is so important, this is kind of my therapy starter pack, these SAGE sessions, is that you want to know this about yourself. And if you resonate with these qualities, it's important to understand as you make sense of not only who you are today, but of your childhood trauma, your adult trauma, and that would be important information, let's say, in your research and therapy and things like that. And secondarily, if you relate to this video in so many ways, it might be a good place for you to go check out and research and watch creators and do all the things to understand if you might have something like high masking autism, for example. Remember, there's a big debate about whether or not autism is a neurotype versus a disorder. The difference in the language can affect how we provide resources and yet can also create stigma and shame and othering. And so I don't have the answers to those things, but if you're popping on this video and saying, oh, isn't everything autism now? No, it's not. But we are at the very beginning of understanding this dynamic, and it is incredibly important to talk about. And also life-changing once you start to say, not everything I struggle with is necessarily trauma-related. There are some things I can do to help protect my brain and body and story. All right, let's get into it. Number one, if you are a highly sensitive person, so we're going to start with the presumption that these are separate, but like I said, hold in mind the massive, really overlap, especially for a phenotype of autism that is very empathy-driven and sensitive, okay? Number one, highly sensitive to sensory input. So you are easily overwhelmed by bright lights, loud noises, strong smells, maybe even certain tastes. At the heart, your senses are easily overwhelmed and often dysregulated. It's not just like, oh, that's a thing. It's like, oh, that's a thing. And it bothers me. I feel angry. I feel just uncomfortable. I feel overstimulated, things like that. Number two, people with HSP qualities are often defined to have really high empathy and really intense emotional awareness. And we know now that you can have autism and have hyperempathy, that this idea that you lack empathy is no longer the way we think about the various ways autism can play out on the spectrum, for example. But essentially, we have a heightened empathy that can often pick up on others, feel their emotions, absorb them as if they're our own. And because of that, that can make social interactions exhausting and overwhelming. As I talk so much about hovering over yourself in both anxiety and trauma and autism and even ADHD, that can be very depleting. And remember that we know that we can be born with a more highly sensitive temperament and not be autistic and not be traumatized, that we know there are certain creatures and animals and humans that are just born with a greater, more sensitive temperament. So this is not something that's woo-woo. This is a real thing. It's just how it might be manifesting in our lives, okay? Number three, intense emotional reactions. We can see somebody reacting both positively and negatively in intense ways, from being moved by conversations and books and literature and music and art. Like there's an intensity around the way your emotions engage with and react to the world. Number 4, a lot of often need for downtime. This is where HSP and things like introvert and autistic and needing to like have time alone to regulate can be really important, because there's so much coming in and input and not a lot of filtering that can often require somebody who gets easily overstimulated, even if they're loving it and they are more socially motivated with something like HSP qualities or autism. They're still often going to need downtime to deal with the toll that can take. Number 4 is often being startled easily. Remember now, this goes back to these all also often match traumatized people, and we're going to talk about how being more sensitive can affect the way you are impacted by trauma, but being easily startled. And so it's like your startle response is often strong. It's because there's such heightened sensitivity that you intensely respond to triggers in the environment that indicate something significant. Is, someone dropped something, someone came out of nowhere, whatever. It's like you're in that heightened kind of fight or flight state a lot of the time. The next one is avoidance of conflict. It makes sense that if you're a highly sensitive person that you might not be able to tolerate conflict. And I've talked a lot about childhood trauma and avoiding conflict, having eggshell parents, but certainly being sensitive, and even some research looking at people with autism more likely to avoid conflict. The amount of social engagement conflict requires, especially if you are sensitive or you had parents who, who didn't handle conflict well, I call eggshell parents, but there's this almost intention to maintain harmony. But we all know that we have to sometimes have hard conversations and self-advocate. And like I've said, that when you grow up in a home with a lot of conflict, anger feels dangerous. And so anything that even feels like anger, including something appropriate like self-advocacy, standing up for yourself, the idea that advocating could create conflict, no thank you. And so avoiding conflict is going to have an impact in your life in other ways, maybe not around the actual experience of being in the conflict, but the avoidance itself creates consequences. The next one is just naturally prone to anxiety. So we're talking about often living in a state of more heightened awareness, maybe fight or flight. That nervous system is more activated, and so you're just more likely to be thinking about things, worrying about things, reacting to things in that regard. And lastly, a lot of HSPs have talked about having intuition and being very perceptive and like picking up on subtle cues. Well, I also think we do this with trauma when we were trained to be hypervigilant in childhood. Certainly people with autism would argue that a lot of this is also pattern recognition alongside maybe having a more cultivated need to read. I really do. I don't know the research on this, but I think this idea that when you're trained to be hypervigilant, to make sense of the parents' little moments, their eye twitch, that means they're going to start yelling at you, or they're sad and it's your job to take care of them, or that the sound of the keys in the door jingling a certain way, if it's an aggressive and the parent comes in and has a deep sigh, that means the rest of your night is going to be maybe chaos. You learn to be hypervigilant all of the time. And this is my big passion around this topic. I truly believe that hypervigilance is the great connector and crossover between a lot of autistic and traumatized individuals and those with anxiety and all of that. So we know that if you think about how responding to people's moods and maybe being sensitive to violence on shows, or being overwhelmed by sensory issues, being even sensitive to medications, things like that, being easily overwhelmed and overstimulated, all of that also looks like autistic criteria. And that is why we are still saying, is this HSP thing really code for autism? There's been some debate about Elaine Aron's work on this dynamic in terms of her own family, that people she based some of her initial research on with HSPs. These were her, I think, god nieces, I want to say. I can't remember the exact language, but they were later diagnosed with autism. I just think it's important to know about yourself, regardless of where you are in terms of identifying it. The labels only dictate treatment or dictate accommodations. And so if you say, yes, I'm HSP, but now I'm thinking I could be autistic, that's important to investigate. Not necessarily for a diagnosis, like I'm saying, but to understand within yourself. Okay, this video is going to go longer again, and I don't want that, but it's happening. What does it mean? What are the long-term effects of trauma for those with sensory sensitivities, like those with HSP Well, we can definitely see that because they have this intensified sensory sensitivity, they're going to process stimuli and experiences and trauma more deeply, more intensely, and that can actually exacerbate and increase the likelihood of trauma developing in the first place. And then because their nervous systems are so hyper focused and finely attuned, and I would say hyper vigilant, that can make them more reactive. It's almost like we are scanning all of the time for both positive and negative sensory experiences, which can deepen and intensify the way we take those things in and how we attempt to navigate them. We can have processing issues in terms of our sensory input affecting how we process information and what we do with it. We can be more likely to just either be hypersensitive or hyposensitive, so excessively or not enough in terms of how we are managing those sensory cues. And then the way that our brains might react to environmental stimuli can make it more likely for things to be overwhelming. And this is where it starts to make me question things around autism, because some new research came out saying that those with autism are more likely to potentially experience PTSD from even what are so-called mild stressors, meaning things like overstimulation at an event or a relational experience that can feel traumatic and is traumatic that we might not think of as traumatic. And there's a big conversation within the autistic community around trauma, that what we identify in the DSM, for example, as PTSD and even complex trauma might highly underestimate the day-to-day nuances of what an autistic brain might experience as traumatic. So we can have these neurobiological changes as a result of trauma, being sensitive. We can see processing areas involved in sensory processing in the brain, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex. All of those can undergo cellular and hormonal changes. And because these changes can keep a person in a prolonged state of fight or flight, that can also affect how we process information from a sensory experience and what we do with it, how we even perceive it. And of course, so there's all kinds of dynamics around our sensory motor responses, and how we engage with motor skills and responding to trauma and before, during, and after. So then really quickly, just to summarize, how does all of this, if this is all connected also potentially to something like autism, create the susceptibility? Well, like I said, as a result of this sensitivity, it's going to increase your risk of experiencing things as traumatic. So things like bullying and abuse, like I said, something like a sensory trigger, like a fire alarm that you can't shut off, feeling abandoned or rejected as a result of the way you engage with the world, the overwhelming nature of not understanding social cues or experiencing repeated like passive aggressiveness that's really bullying, which it can be at something like your job or school, social difficulties, having a hard time with transitions. This is very common for those with neurodivergence, transitioning from one thing. Now I'm going to go from, this as a parent for many kids, when it's time to go from home to the car to school, those can be really difficult for a lot of kids for many reasons. And so we've learned a lot about giving kids warnings. I used to do with one of my boys, just putting my hand on his shoulder and being like, hey babe, in about 5 minutes, we're going to go. Something about that was more helpful than, hey, we're going. So the bottom line is that these things in terms of our brains can affect how we respond to trauma. And we know that autistic individuals, especially women and gender diverse people, face a higher risk of both victimization and marginalization. And that one study found that 70% of autistic adults reported experiencing some form of victimization, I'll put the word down below, after age 14 compared to 45% of non-autistic individuals. So regardless of whether it's your sensitivity and or autism, it's important. Why it matters is that it increases your risk, and things that you might be talking about in therapy that you thought were no big deal, for example, might actually have been traumatic and might be affecting your life. And it's important to put these pieces together. So once again, how our brain responds with being more sensitive, how we process traumatic events, the repeated chronic stress of living in toxic environments, of being repeatedly invalidated with something like, oh, you're just sensitive, get over it, you're such a crybaby, for example, which also may be autism, may or may not. So all of these things can really create and increase our risk for trauma. So I would argue that regardless of how you see it, if you are a highly sensitive person, you have ADHD and or autism, there's a very good chance that your risk of trauma and traumatic experiences is higher, and could be little t traumas, relational traumas, big T traumas. And just to summarize it here, studies have found significantly higher rates of PTSD among autistic individuals compared to the general population. 32 to 60% of autistic people may experience PTSD in their lifetime, compared to about 4% in the general population. 32 to 60 compared to 4. And even when traditional PTSD criteria are not met, autistic people, and I would say also highly sensitive people potentially, often develop PTSD-like symptoms in response to less intense traumas. And that's something that I've been talking about in a lot of videos. And so I'll talk more about that. I've made videos already around autism and trauma. But the bottom line of this is that it is important to understand if your brain takes in the environment and sensory stimuli in more intense ways, to really unpack how that's affected your life in the past, how it affects you today, and ways to ideally accommodate and protect yourself more in the future. So that's it. Thanks for being here. Have a lovely day. I'm going now, I mentioned yesterday, to go get this mole biopsied and maybe have to get plastic surgery on this little thing. So you might see me with some Band-Aids. And yes, I will still be showing up that way with them here. I can do without the negative comments on those things. So please keep your thoughts to yourself. I'm motivated to be here, and I'm going to be doing it, hopefully rain or shine. So I appreciate you so much. Have a good day, and I'll see you tomorrow.